Well, I just wanted to, um, first of all, just say how delighted we are to do this talk and to share some of the work that we've been
That's
doing.
good, guys. It's working now.
Perfect. Um, and it's been a really interesting process for us to sort of review a chapter of our work that we did about 5, 6 years back, about 5, 6 years ago. Um, and that body of work spans quite an interesting period in Russian history. As Aaron said, we moved to Moscow and we worked there for 6 years. And the country went from something that was more optimistic towards something that was much more pessimistic and a much more challenging context for us to work. So it's quite an interesting chapter in our lives. What we'd like to do is we've got maybe 7 projects that we'd like to discuss today. And 5 of those are existing buildings and some of the spaces within them, and 2 of them are new projects and new spaces.
I've got football.
And for the purposes of this talk, we've narrowed it down to talk about the sort of public space components in those buildings, and why we've done that, I think, will become clear as we go into the scheme of the different projects. Before we also start, we wanted to make sure that we acknowledge and thank everyone who worked with us in the studio in Moscow, both with us, but also collaborators externally, but also importantly clients and sort of members of the public who really made a difference to the way that we thought about building spaces, but actually were instrumental in giving us the agency to make those projects happen. And I think too often architects talk about their work as if it's a product of their own genius, rather than actually the architect having a very small role, an important one nonetheless, but actually they're part of a much wider coterie of individuals who make projects happen. So thanks to everyone, particularly Sonia Chepetareva, if she's there. I don't know if you're there, but anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through 7 projects. Some we're going to talk more about the context, some we're not. And then we're going to, at the end, we've got 3 or 4 themes that we wanted to sort of pull out and talk about. I imagine we're going to be about 35, 40 minutes. So I hope that will be all right with everyone. So I'll just sort of dive in. So Moscow, this is kind of our first project in Russia, and this is ZIL Cultural Center, which is one of the certainly is the largest actually workers' club, sort of avant-garde workers' club, built between 1920 and the Second World War. This is probably of a similar scale for those of you in London to, I would guess, the Royal Festival Hall. And it has quite a large auditorium. It has teaching spaces, cultural spaces, all sorts of activities. And what's interesting about this is that it was designed by the Vesnin brothers, particularly Alexander Vesnin, and it was completed between 1937 and 1938, which, for those of you who know your Russian history, 1939 was the year of a great deal of the Stalinist purges, and the architectural history in the 30s is quite fraught, such that by the end of this period, sort of by 1939, this sort of quite stripped international style modernism had really fallen out of favour. And there's this fascinating moment where lots of buildings suddenly had applied classical motifs and other details. But this is one of the last buildings that was sort of completed intact, as it were, as intended. Just as a little sidebar, just at the top here is the planetarium and telescope that was installed. That was in fact our first studio in Moscow, and that's where we worked for a long period of time, sort of really embedded within the different functions within the building. Oh, IT skills letting me down. There we go. So just to give you a bit more context, on the left is the original building. That's the one that was built, but actually it was a smaller element in a bigger plan, and there was going to be a very large, almost Congress hall scaled auditorium And both these buildings were related to the enormous and very important and prestigious motor factory named after Lenin in Moscow, which is euphemistically called ZIL, which stands for Zavod Ilyich Lenin,
yes,
which is his factory, basically. But it gives you a sense of the scale of the projects that were taking place. And this is the building more or less today. It's really quite wonderful. It's fortunately not been molested too much in recent years, and actually much of our project was trying to stop it being molested in the sense of being changed, renewed, refreshed. So it's a kind of snapshot in time as we sort of approached it. This is a view towards the library and some external gym spaces, I think. And we went through a lot of archive work and a lot of understanding about the building. Here is Lenin in one of his kind of ubiquitous poses. And you can get a real sense of the sort of scale and sort of dynamism of the building, I suppose. This is another one of the public spaces shortly after completion. And one of the challenges has been to sort of really get under the skin and understand this. And I might refer back to some of these sort of random elements of furniture that sort of find themselves within the building space. But in the past 70 years, this building has gone through some previous renewals. This is the foyer to the auditorium, and it has this rather wonderful quality, slightly surreal quality. This is sort of 70s, I would say.
Yeah.
Probably sort of Soviet details. So we've got this kind of pillowing sort of.
This is the better one.
This is
out of
yes.
Several iterations.
Which kind of you can imagine that's pretty amazing when it's lit up, or certainly when it was all working. There's applied marble onto the concrete columns. There's this rather ghastly floor, and then this rather super timber paneling behind which is all the sort of buffet and what's called garderobe, which is your cloakroom, sort of hidden away from the foyer space. So that was probably in the 70s, and then in the 2000s, I would
probably
guess.
Yes, early 2000s. Yes.
This started to appear within the building, which is pretty yucky. Stretch ceilings at the top are incredibly popular, or were incredibly popular at the time. Again, this sort of slightly over the top parquet flooring. We've got some DIY merchant pretend stone on the walls, and the bane of our lives, the way this space is used is literally as the furniture is laid out. So basically people are pushed into or sort of corralled to the edge of the space, but it's still spatially pretty good. The windows haven't been replaced since the 70s. So originally they were timber, much more filigree than this, oddly enough. This is an aluminium system, and a lot of buildings in Russia have suffered where windows have been replaced and you lose that sense of texture. And this is one of our earliest photographs from ZIL, and this kind of encapsulates the idea of public space in Russia. This is the entrance foyer to the building. To your right, you've got a cafe that's shut, but most importantly, on the left, you have the welcoming committee, which is basically two bored security guys on a piece of office furniture who basically want to turn you away from the building. And that's how most public buildings operate. They are for use for a defined activity with a defined ticket. Other than that, you're not really welcome. So this contemporary idea of meeting friends, having a coffee, co-working, all that kind of jazz, just doesn't occur in Russia, and that was very much part
didn't occur at that time.
Didn't occur at that time, and that was very much part of our client's brief: is how can these buildings act as a host to achieve that? So some of our first activities were actually just tidying the building up and trying to make good what was already there. So this is a couple of views of the ground floor spaces. You can see there's two staircases that take you up into the education rooms, and virtually nothing there is original. So there is this sort of sense of there being layers and alterations, and this sense of that it's an organic, evolving building. Whether it's as good as it was when it was first built, that's a good question, but it's still a good set of spaces. This is the entrance again, looking the other way, and you have these huge arrays of coat hooks and wardrobe and cloakroom that really are practically, they have to be at the front door, and they do become quite a dominating part of the scheme, part of the building. So one of the first things that we did was to try and make sense of the wayfinding and the graphics within the building. Pretty small scale stuff, but things that we fabricated ourselves. We made all these elements ourselves. And essentially the game here is that these are actually covers for fire hydrant hoses that were built into the building. So rather than adding another set of elements attached to the building, we repurposed things that had been there since time immemorial and really used them as a way of navigating through the building, which was quite successful and really gave the spaces a kind of different feel. Related to that, this is a photo from the 30s of that entrance space. So those two guys on their office furniture would be just outshot on the right-hand side as you look at this. And you can see that originally there was a large kind of information blackboard type wall, some explaining what was happening in the building. And presumably this was a sort of reception desk on the left that you could then go and find out where your class was and where you were going. So one of the projects that we did was to reintroduce a sort of contemporary interpretation of that. So this is a sort of plasterboard sculptural element that seeks to define quite loosely, I suppose, and capture space within a bigger room and have a sort of syncopatic relationship with the existing columns. There was a large table that was scaled for children, which is where the lady's sitting there. And then just off shot to the left, there's a large, sort of quite utilitarian sort of reception desk, very deliberately designed to feel as if it was constructed, it was there temporarily, and this was just a snapshot in time as an installation. Again, we fabricated all of these elements ourselves and worked through till about 4 a.m. before the opening, applying all the vinyl graphics on the wall, because we really wanted to sort of make it happen. And that's very much part of our practice. So this is another view of this sculptural wall that sort of greets you as you come in. And that wall has changed over time. The vinyl's been replaced. It's had new graphics, new information. And really it's become a sort of canvas which they have been using to act as a sort of large scale notice board, I suppose. Further work that we did in the building, we decided that we didn't really want to be adding another layer of sort of accretions onto the interior. So we did a lot of work with this is a new children's library, again, designing elements that are bigger than furniture, but smaller than buildings. And these sort of characters then pop up and can be used in the building to define spaces or to guide people through the building. And they are meant to be quite good fun, and they're meant to feel as if they would probably just sort of wander off in 5 years' time as the building continued to evolve and change. And those characters then appeared also outside. So this is one of 7 sort of small architectural forms, I think they translate as in Russian, that sort of inhabit the landscape outside the building. This one lights up so that the arrow has lots of little holes that light up at night and are really there to spread the sphere of influence of the building into the public realm, both within its immediate context, but its wider context in that part of Moscow. But oddly enough, one of the most successful parts of the project wasn't something we added, but it was rather an edit. This is shortly after we did it, this is the library in Zil, and we removed about 20% of the bookcases and rotated them 30 degrees into the building. And this has proved to be enormously successful because it's completely changed the way people think about libraries, strangely. And as part of that, we created, I don't know if you can see, but these little pockets, I don't know if you see my mouse, but anyway, on the left-hand side where people could sit and read a book. Very simple, very straightforward. But if you Google image search for library, it's actually this library comes up on that first page as a kind of archetypal image for a library, certainly in Russia. So there's something very successful about just organizing things within an existing building. So we're now going to move on to a second project, which off the back of our work in ZIL, we were then invited by Moscow Culture Department to start looking at other buildings.
I just want to add a little bit about the previous project, and it's probably relevant for most of our projects when we worked with existing buildings in Russia, is that, yes, we did quite small design interventions, but for all of these buildings, the biggest move was to open them, to make them truly public, to remove the security guy from the door, to make sure you have completely free access to all the spaces, and to make it so that people can feel it's their building and no one is questioning why you're there and what are you doing.
Yeah, and I think that's probably our biggest achievement, actually, is getting these buildings open and accessible.
Yeah. So the next project we're going to talk about is a small cultural building which is hidden in the middle of an experimental system-built housing district in Moscow, which was originally intended for the athletes' accommodation during the Moscow Olympics. And this is the view of the main entrance of the building, and you can see that it's a decaying building. It's laughably inaccessible. It's surrounded by derelict shops that are occupying leftover spaces all the way around it. And indeed, if you did manage to get into this building, this is what you will see. It's kind of prison-like cloakroom, which is the main feature, and the central piece really is the security guy's desk, who will probably almost certainly ask you to leave. These were the so-called public spaces, so it's the corridors connecting different functions within the building. And our proposal was actually a really simple one, because the building had this really chaotic cellular interior with lots of spaces without natural light. About 30% of the building was occupied by an illegal flat, which director organized for himself within this cultural center. So this is the looking closest to us is the main entrance to the building. So this is the whole plan, which is to reorientate you. The main entrance is at the top right corner. We've got a small, cute auditorium with a public foyer. In the middle of the building is a glazed courtyard, which you wouldn't know was there when you came in, and the entrance hall and the really tiny cellular spaces scattered around it. So our proposal was really simple. The idea was to refine the existing logic of the building to renew the importance of the public spaces, to reopen the courtyard which connected all of them around, and it did cause considerable conflict with the client team and the authorities, because originally they imagined that we'll just do some sort of interior decoration project. But this was the key move in our proposal. So making models is a big part of our practice, and it really helps, especially with existing buildings, it really helps us to understand the building, to understand the spaces we're working with. It's also the best way to testing the spaces you're creating in terms of the natural light, and also it also helps us think about the language of the design. So the previous image, sorry, was a view through the reopen courtyards, which helps you visually connect the public spaces that are organized around it and the renewed courtyard. This is the view of the flexible foyer spaces with simple furniture and the screens that help you occupy it in a different way. And one of the key but really simple moves was to introduce this simple ball lights on metal frame, which gave different character to different spaces. And this is the idea we've borrowed from one of the altars built in the library in Vyborg, which we found was very successful.
I'm just in a webinar.
And it was an incredibly painful project on site.
Yeah, it's
and
live.
it was really
I'll go
hard
ahead,
to
Lewes.
achieve what we achieved.
You don't need
I won't go into detail why, but that's the story of most of our projects in Russia. And so this is the finished project. You can see the quality of the natural light is really great. We've the spaces themselves are neutral, and it's the furniture and the people that animate it. So we've designed the tables and the bookshelves and a small cafe counter. And yes, so this is the foyer of the auditorium. Again, really flexible, really simple space with lights giving it a little bit of character. We managed to reopen and rationalize the education and teaching spaces. And at the entrance, we introduced this small, cheeky furniture character that greets you as you arrive into the building. And it doesn't really have a clear function. It's kind of a bench slash book exchange, coffee table, but it really does make it special as you arrive into the building. And this is a view towards the main entrance. And as I said, it was really difficult project because there was a lot of resistance from different
Sorry.
there was a lot of
Sorry.
Some
IT.
IT issues. And one of the hardest things to do was to open up the main entrance to it sounds easy as just to make a glazed entrance, but it was incredibly hard. But the bottom line is that we couldn't do anything with the context in which this building was placed. And we also failed with the courtyard, as you can see in this last image.
So there's quite interesting tension between a space that's been sort of opened up and renewed and given a polish, and then the immediate context and the sort of sense of sort of slightly depressing failure. that you were sort of then enjoying from inside the building. But I can't underline how difficult this project was. There's a whole story about this one. So off the back of that, we then picked up two more projects, which we're going to touch on very quickly. The first one was for a liberal economy and social university, independent from the state, and they had been given a building about 500 meters from Red Square, and they had this is a Brezhnev area, so probably 80s, sort of cinema that had been grafted on top of a pre-revolutionary building, and essentially we were gutting that and then putting in a new library. And essentially the scheme here was to try and take our idea of introducing characters or interventions into the building up a scale. So what we ended up proposing was a elevated library reading room within that space, which then sat upon a seemingly random structure underneath of cantilevers, and really tried to animate what is in effect quite a boring building. And this was a pretty exciting project for us. And something that we wanted to do was also try and reflect the realities of construction, because we'd learned a lot from previous projects about what was and what wasn't possible. So with the sort of table structure,
Or a pot, rather.
the thing that we really wanted to do was to have quite a coarse blockwork construction enclosing and hiding away the sort of more quiet, introspective reading spaces at the upper level. And we thought that was a technology that was perfectly achievable with Russian construction techniques. And then above that would be hidden this sort of much more quiet, introspective space surrounded by a sort of very deep acoustic plaster, a bit similar to Asplen's Stockholm Library, if any of you know that building. And then it was all about kind of layering and transparency in terms of security and in terms of access. Now, this project is built, and we're not going to show you any images of what was built, because this was a project we actually decided for various reasons that once it got to a certain point, we didn't want to continue with. And part of that was the owner of the building was actually not someone who we wanted to spend time with and really engage with, and his attitudes weren't really appropriate to thinking about the wider world. So thereby hangs the tale. We also, as you can see by this point, had our son with us. So he's about 6 days old in that pushchair in the front there. So our priorities were starting to change at this point, I think.
Well, I think in this project and all of our Moscow projects, we would normally have a small team, client team, who were really enthusiastic, who were really on the same page with us, and really with a European outlook, and understood what a true public building is and how it's supposed to work. But it was really difficult to communicate that to the rest of the team who were involved in delivering all these ideas. And there was always a huge resistance, because people didn't understand what we're doing, why we're doing that, and they were by the end of the day, they were not really interested in making things better.
And I think what's interesting about this project is something was built that actually is fairly close to what we've just shown as a design. And we might reflect on that towards the end of this, just to draw that together in terms of the conclusions. Also related to this, we were invited by the rector of probably the largest state university in Russia to look at part of their estate, this is just one of a very large campus of buildings, sort of classic, sort of late Soviet system built, quite a lot of marble buildings. And we were brought on as it was going through some fairly brutal refurbishment, I think. But this is the existing kind of character of those buildings. Very good daylight, very open, slightly sort of sad, but have a sort of cinematic quality to them. But in other ways, completely inappropriate for sort of contemporary use and the way that students would understand space. So this is one of the few places where they could sit down, and you can get a sense of this layering of both a kind of Soviet language, but then also a sort of classical language and a sort of quite messy sort of layering into the building. And what we did is we sort of did a very exhausting study of this building. And I think that's one of the things that we really value, is that we were given quite a lot of time to review and explore this building and understand how it feels. I mean, geometrically, it's quite simple, but some of the spaces are quite rich. And we introduced the idea again of different sorts of characters that could then occupy spaces in different ways for different activities. So some of them were like this, about providing disabled lifts and disabled facilities and toilets. Some of them were about coffee bars, some of it about wayfinding. We did lots of other proposals and work in relation to lighting and ceiling and renewing of finishes, but really we tried to, like at ZIL, keep it quite low key and really try and make good the qualities, the latent qualities that are in the building. You can see some of the themes have come through from Chitanova in terms of ball lights and kind of slightly quirky characters. There's this sort of giraffe-like table on the right. It doesn't feel like it feels like it's got too many legs. But also trying to renew and make relevant a lot of the decisions that had been made in the building in the 70s and 80s, and also to reflect sort of contemporary uses and spaces. This building was the first of about 6 very, very large buildings that we looked at, but we tried to bring a sensibility to those buildings and spaces that was ambiguous, I suppose. And I think that ambiguity is something that we're really interested in terms of the work that we do. Related again, similar project is another one of these workers' clubs. This one's in Zelenograd, which didn't used to exist on the maps. It's one of those kind of cities, secret towns on the edge of Moscow. And instead of a workers' club or a house of culture, they have a palace of culture. This is it, palatial in its beauty. And it was sort of in this miserable car park arrangement. And this was the sort of typical front entrance space, doors locked, these ghastly graphics for ghastly performances of stuff.
Christmas lights throughout the year.
And, it was a pretty miserable building. And our project here was to take some of those latent qualities. So this is a 3-story atrium that sits in the middle of the building, which is used for sort of buffet and sort of other events when they have performances. And this building has 2 auditoriums in it. One is 1,000 people and one is 800 seater. So one can imagine that on those rare occasions that events take place and everyone spills out, this building is absolutely full of activity and life and people. We never saw that, but in theory, that's what the building was designed for, to accommodate. So this part of the project focused on the public spaces that were contained within a building which is essentially thousands of tessellated triangles, for want of a better way of putting it. And the building is really, the geometry of the building is very rigorous. So there was a uniformity and homogeneity to it. So we tried very hard to start introducing kind of depth and accents, and without trying to be too willful, sort of add some variety into these buildings and spaces. We didn't try and change the lights. We didn't try and change the sort of some of the furniture. We didn't try and change the paneling, but rather we tried to renew it in a way that would make it relevant. We sort of learned to love this kind of flooring in the main foyer spaces, but really we tried to just add and renew what was there. So we amended the profile of the handrail to this staircase, but other than that we didn't do very much. So it's little details that we just tried to introduce into the building. Again, oh, we've got something really exciting going on outside. Oh, we've got, who is it? Sorry, didn't plan this. I think we've got possibly Extinction Rebellion having a march past, so that's good. So we designed quite a lot of furniture for this building again, but we did design new lights to go into, sorry, it's quite exciting. New lights to go into the entrance. So we did take out some of the triangles just at the beginning. And we did do quite a lot of work to open up the building, work with the director, or try and work with the director to get lights on, doors open. And we introduced quite a lot of external lighting into the building so that the profile was much higher. It's questionable whether we were able to make lasting change on this building, because ultimately, shortly after we finished the project, the doors went locked, the lights went off. And whether anyone actually ever did get to do things like this and jump around and run around in the building, I'm not so sure. These girls are in a break between classes, so you know, they were having some fun, even if no one else was allowed into the building. So we've got two projects to go, and I hope we're not overrunning too much on the time. These are quite different projects. We're sort of going up a scale now. Those initials at the bottom there stand for VDNH, which in Russian is, what does VDNH stand for?
It's exhibition of national achievements in agriculture, something.
Agricultural Soviet republics. Basically, it's a huge area, sort of in just on the sort of middle of Moscow, not right in the middle, but slightly to one side. And it's this exotic zoo of sort of mainly Stalinist, but also late Soviet pavilions and landscape. And it's a bit like a kind of World's Fair, but an incredibly popular one. And, you know, this is an ice rink that goes in the winter. It's a completely surreal place, and the scale of it is enormous. And we were approached to essentially look at a small part of it, which comprised 89 buildings and 600 trees, and to start to put together a master plan for a new education campus of buildings that could support both teenagers, but also people going back to work. And when the brief was written, admittedly in part by us, there was this optimism about a kind of changing face of education and a kind of much more contemporary view about how people could shape their own futures. I think by the time we left, that had changed. And this is sort of post-Crimea, post-Donbass, and the country had become something different, and the project ended up as something quite different. But what we did is we looked at the external spaces and started to think about how buildings and forms could define external spaces. And we developed a master plan of uses across two main existing buildings retained, which are the more straightforward ones, and then 5 or 3 clusters of other buildings which had a much looser, much more dynamic arrangement. And essentially the pink is public space, cafes, you know, lounging, circulation. And then the other colors represent different types of educational space that were created within these buildings. And you can see this is the first floor. You get much more sort of more cellular classrooms, but every room has at least 2 sides of window, and there's a much looser kind of dynamic about how the building stacks up in each case. I won't go into the detail, But again, we worked through a large number of models at different scales. This is one of tens, I would say, of different models that we made at this scale to really start to get to understand the relationship of the buildings and spaces that we are creating. Here again, we've got some diagrams. And, the idea was very much to sort of look through spaces, across spaces, and to give a structure for people to occupy the building, but not make it so rigid that it was very prescriptive. It was meant to be very, very loose. And that's the sort of sense of the massing of the buildings through the site. This is quite a large model, which really expressed how the building was put together. This is another view of that model. And this is a wonderful model made by, a series of models made by Sonia, who I mentioned earlier. And we really wanted to let the massing and the form do quite a lot of work and not rely on a sort of decoration or, a kind of constructional complexity. Rather, this was meant to be sort of quite simple block work, then rendered. And the key thing was really the scale of the windows, the rhythm of the windows, and the massing and the way that light fell upon the forms. And, these are really quite nice buildings, and ones that we were, very, very proud of. And one of the ideas that we had, this is a detail study, was that we could then play with the depth of that render on the upper levels. And on this building, we're proposing that they're sort of scooped out, so it's with dishes. So essentially, again, anyone can do it. It's just render onto slightly thicker insulation that's been CNC cut into a regular, although seemingly irregular, pattern of dimples. And the only special thing in the facade were these more decorative sort of tutti frutti ice cream, which is probably a reference that doesn't make any sense to you, but kind of much more interesting elements on what is quite a classical, ubiquitous sort of Russian window arrangement. And this is a sort of render. This building had a more combed facade, so again, quite low tech. And there was a real sense of transparency and layering and being able to navigate and explore the buildings in a very open and friendly way. This project was built. This is a satellite grab. We decided, or rather, without going into too much detail, everyone involved in this project was embezzling funds. And there was a sort of sense of corruption throughout everything we were doing. We were the only people who weren't on the take. And ultimately, we didn't feel terribly comfortable in that environment, because I think everyone saw us as a threat because they didn't have anything on us, as it were. So again, it was built, but we're not going to show you the actual finished result very consciously. And we'll talk about that some more in a moment. So one last project, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm sure Aaron will tick me off in a second. But this is a project for I suppose it's a university, but it's more of a
education center,
sort of cultural education center for what's called a monotown, just outside of Moscow. A monotown is where there is basically a town exists for only one industry and one factory. This town makes steel tubes and pipes and all wheels for Russian trains, for example. So it's all about steel and iron and casting and extruding. It's very much that kind of environment. And they wanted a new building that would be a technological university, an educational building, a cultural building for the city. So a really kind of quite hybrid, mixed use building. And we can talk about context and how the building sits within context or not, but essentially it tries to make its own context, where we developed a strategy of the structural form actually sort of articulating an arrangement of spaces around a large triangular courtyard, and then different forms and different types of public and private functions scattered around. And then above which, it's hard to read here, slightly more introspective education spaces and light wells into this large sort of industrial form. This was the plan. We had a lot of fun with this plan, as you can probably tell. But essentially you would come in to an entrance, there's a reception desk with a little courtyard, more private functions, auditorium, foyer, sort of cafe, co-working kind of zone, an art gallery, and then all the green and yellow are all technology and sort of education, research, sort of industrial workshops. This is the more kind of architectural plan, which I couldn't resist showing, but maybe not interesting to everyone. But essentially, this project was about transparency, openness, and also about how you really bring the general public into what is a quasi-public, quasi-private educational building in a way that really opens up how people can use the space, how the building invites occupation, but isn't necessarily prescriptive in terms of how it's used. So this is an external summer courtyard space. And then internally, this structural form, this steel structures essentially act as trestles upon which a quite simple precast concrete sort of deck is placed. And there's a rationality to all this. All these columns sit within an 8-meter grid, and there's a sort of logic. There's some redundancy, but it is pretty efficient in terms of the structure really doing a lot of the spatial organization and really giving the ground floor in particular a sense of organization and activity. This is the auditorium looking through the courtyard space. And then on the upper level, we had these kind of really kind of quite generous, I suppose, sort of teaching rooms. Again, there's a lot of transparency and there's a lot of embedded flexibility here with screens that can be pulled across. And this very large sort of headlight window, if you know your Melnikov, there's a wonderful garage he did late in his career, which has a similar kind of motif. And, here we were sort of proposing to use sort of cast glass rather than metal, so you get a kind of dappled light into the space. And then within the ground floor, there would be these kind of quite large, a bit like some of the spaces we looked at in some of the other buildings that didn't seem to have a clear function, but had a kind of latent quality and invited different activities to take place, whether that's just a bit of co-working or whether it's a dance event or something like that. And really to sort of create a complex habitat of spaces that coherently hang together as a sort of set of buildings. I think that's the last slide. So, is there anything you wanted to add, and then I can sort of wrap up?
No? Yeah, you go for it.
So, shall I stop sharing, and then I don't know if you want to look at us or not, but anyway, I'll do that anyway. So, there we go, you can look at us now. So, I think the arc of our work in Russia was really, we started by looking on how we can augment, add, reinstate qualities in existing buildings. And after 6 years, we'd sort of moved to the other end of that spectrum, which was we were creating spaces and buildings that had qualities that could then be adapted and occupied by future users. And I think that's quite an interesting reversal in our role as we did projects. It is difficult to share our projects in Russia. We've never shown any of these projects to any kind of audience, public audience before, even though it's a good chunk of our lives. And part of that challenge, and it's one that I think is really important for us as an architectural profession, is that in these projects, there's a very clear disjunction between what we designed and what was built. And I think it's fair to say that in all the projects, what was built, the latent qualities, the moves, the sort of attitude to buildings and spaces is still present, but the physical manifestation, the detail, is not how we would have done it, to put it bluntly. And I think there's a risk that architects tend to look at work and sort of say, well, that was the intention. What was built was the intention. And I think we've learned that very rarely is it what you actually intend that gets built. It's rather an approximation, and it's that ambiguity which we think is really important, and one that we're deeply suspicious of when you see images that sort of present something as being perfect, because it very rarely is perfect. So I think our approach is very much about a kind of richness in possibility, but also a kind of richness in doubt, in the fact that you're not quite sure what it's going to do, how it's going to be used, and by whom. And I think that's another facet or challenge in a lot of public spaces, is that public buildings need to support a really complex and quite often conflicting set of readings by different people. And something that we are very attuned to is what we describe as a kind of hotelification, for want of a better word, where there's ever increasing sort of specialization and tailoring of buildings and spaces to be sort of
styling
and sort of solving all the problems that don't really exist. And it's a kind of enshittification, if I can use that word. I know it's used for the internet, but it's of public space, where it's just kind of getting worse by people trying to make it more tailored and make it better. And I think it is that looseness and ambiguity that's really, really important. And as a kind of conclusion, we describe ourselves as an itinerant practice, and that's very true. I mean, these projects were created over a period where essentially we moved workspace, we moved house, we moved flat more or less every year throughout that period. And in fact, we still do. And those spaces we worked in, those spaces we lived in, had very little in common, other than they were all good spaces. They had a kind of generosity. They were a bit odd. They were interesting. And we were then forced to kind of sort of adapt to where we lived and adapt where we worked and how we worked. And we do think as architects, that's actually the thing that we should be trying to do. Let's create good spaces and not try and be too prescriptive about how people use them. And, part of that idea is also, I mean, I'm clearly English, Irina's Russian. I was working in a foreign context. We're now working in the UK, and I think, there's a slightly more foreign context for you. And there is that idea of being a foreigner in a country is actually a quality that architects should try and have. And by that, I don't mean a sort of desire to assimilate, and nor do I mean a sort of expat romanticization of home, but rather I think architects should be feeling ill at ease, uncomfortable, hyper aware, but also very detached and sort of relying on instinct on projects. And I think in our work, we've really enjoyed that detachment, but also, as I alluded earlier, that sense of having time to really work on instinct and really get under the skin of how spaces could be, and then see how those spaces can adapt and be changed over time. And also, the incredibly difficult, much wider context of social, economic, political, cultural challenges that you need to situate any work that you do, any project that you do. And, working in Russia, in the last decade has been certainly that. It's certainly been a challenge, and one that, we look back on fondly, despite it being incredibly difficult, and actually not having, or not yet feeling able to show a lot of the results of that hard work. But we're getting there. So it's kind of cathartic to do this exercise, to sort of talk about things. So, Aaron, we've overrun a bit, so apologies there.
It's
We
all
did
right,
try.
you're forgiven. We're having a little listening party upstairs, and I can tell you that we're delighted with what we're seeing, not only the quality of the work, which I kind of knew a little bit about, and maybe some of the others in the room not so much, which is fantastic, but the quality of the presentation, the way that you guys are able to articulate the ideas behind the projects, and to show how the projects, I think more importantly, how the projects are delivering on some of those ideas through kind of developing tactics and strategies that are manifest in the buildings. I think that was really phenomenal. Just to let everyone know, there is a Q&A function, and several people have posted questions to the speakers already, which I'm going to relay. I think I can probably group a few of them together because they're kind of all hinting at a similar sort of trajectory, and so my way of interpreting that is that there are a few people that I think were picking up on some of particularly the first two projects where you were talking about the idea of resistance within what may be a cultural resistance within the client group, or maybe it's something else, but it kind of, I suppose it brings to the fore a question that all architects face, which is that there are times when you might see an opportunity or a potential for something which is being resisted by a client group or an individual client. And then you start to come into conflict with that client group, whether it's amicable or otherwise. And I suppose, as I said, every architect goes through that. In those particular cases, it was largely centered around this idea of the publicness of the building, or the sort of civic depth, to kind of borrow a phrase of some of those public buildings. So, the extent to which the public could enter, and that, from my very brief experience in Russia, I could completely understand what you were saying about the kind of ubiquitous security guard at the front door that wants you to fuck off. That's kind of a thing.
Yep.
So, I mean, how do you position yourself when you find yourself in that situation, and not fall into the trap of being the table thumping architect of yore who would simply assert that they are right and you are wrong because they have greater knowledge, education, genius, whatever, and maybe a kind of updated version of what an architect does, which is perhaps to be a better listener, be more sensitive to the needs of a client group, but also knowing that you do have insight and education that you would expect is in excess of what your client may do. So therefore, there is, as you phrased it, an ambiguity about your role, or where the line is, how far you can push, and to what degree. So would you guys maybe like to speak to that, and maybe just kind of let us know what position you have taken as a practice when it comes to asserting your ideas within the project?
Well, I think there's sort of different ways of answering that. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the term architect, or the role of the architect in Russia, has been completely debased over the past 50 years, where we champion the idea of architect with a capital A, the person who deals with the contract, deals with the money, does with the detailing, gets the hand dirty, deals with planning, it has a very broad remit. In Russia, I think the architect has been reduced to someone who does design, and someone who kind of makes the pretties, as our son would put it. And I think with all these projects, we are able to win over the majority of the client group, and I think it's worth pointing out that these projects, there are other people you work with, the builders, the building managers, the funders, as it were, the politicians who are not part of that client group but can directly affect it. But I think what we did was two things. The first one was we would actually approach that without any design solution. We would be articulating an ambition, and we would be defending ideas that were clearly not about our ego. There was no kind of, and we built this, we want to build that. Here's a design, that's the thing we want to get published. And that in a way is our biggest achievement in these buildings, as we did get them open. But that's not something that you can show in a lecture, and I think client groups tended to really respect that, the fact that we were not trying to get something out of it for ourselves. And by not proposing a design solution, we actually achieved things. But also a slight contradiction is that we would invest, and we still do invest, considerable amounts of time at the beginning of a project to really understand and to really propose, when we get to that stage, ideas that have been very thoroughly worked out. And it means that commercially we're terrible businessmen, because we basically do all the hard, valuable bit quite often for free at the beginning of a project. But it means that we can then discuss occupation, way people use buildings, because we've spent a month hanging around. We've spent a month going to these events. We've really gone there at different times. We've really understood it, and then we've developed proposals that very directly speak to the way the building is used and occupied. And I think that again is quite undervalued. The sort of sense of clients want things tomorrow, when actually we always try and argue for, well, we need lots of time to think about it. That's not because we're lazy, it's because we want to really imbibe the building, we want to imbibe the spaces, but most importantly, we want to understand how people use it already. And then you've already got an argument to change things.
Yeah, I think it's also important not to forget that we were in an unusual position, because we were kind of outsiders. We came from the UK. We both had kind of a European experience and European understanding of what the public space was. And most of these buildings were Soviet buildings, which were not necessarily designed or being used as this kind of open, really flexible, really liberal public space. And I think the clients in Russia looked at us and they trusted us, because we did have that different experience and different understanding of how these buildings might become more relevant to the country, and in particular to Moscow, which was looking to Europe and looking to become more open and more European. So I think we had a different perspective on things, and that was certainly appreciated and understood by the people we worked with.
I think that's, just to echo that, I think we had the same experience when we came back from Russia back to the UK, because we had been out of the UK for nearly a decade. And when we came back, we kind of understood everything, but we understood nothing. But we had this kind of different set of experiences, and we had a sort of otherness about us, that we could really understand things in a different way. And that was quite effective in terms of communicating the way to make things better to clients, because we could be quite laser focused on things that I think other people had started to accept. I think we've been here, 5 years now back in the UK. I think we've both got itchy feet at the moment to sort of relocate again. But that's not really answering the question, because I don't think there is a catch-all answer. But I hope it goes a little bit towards that kind of line of thinking.
You've got another correspondent here, Liam. who says, thanks very much for your talk. Fascinating. The use of characters and small interventions to elucidate and or embellish the qualities of an existing space. Question 1. So Liam thinks because he began with thanks very much and fascinating that he can ask 2 questions. So question 1 is, how did this technique come about? And I'll add my own little commentary. It put me in the mind of Florian Bagel and his, what do you call them, awkward friends. I don't know if that was sort of where you guys were coming from, but that sort of jumped out to me. Question 2, this is an obviously useful strategy in our current architectural paradigm, dealing with material efficiencies and the need to reuse, extend, augment the life of our buildings. Do you have any musings on how the implementation of changes, particularly as the scale enlarges? I probably read out that last sentence incorrectly, or it's written slightly weirdly, but there you go. There's 2 questions, and I just need to turn off my camera so that Stu can leave the office in his cycle kit, because I'm currently blocking the entrance, and he's standing there in his light.
Leave it on. We've had Extinction Rebellion, so you know we can cyclist, I'm sure. Oh, there.
There we go. Nice. Enjoyed the talk. It's just not one for
very good.
Right, go for it, guys.
Well, I'll answer the second question first, which is, I think we probably, as a profession, and I think as a kind of late capitalist culture, I think we try too hard to change and adapt and design things, actually. And I think, you know, we would be much better off just making do with what we've got. And I think there probably is too much design. There's too many architects. I mean, we used to do a lot of charity work in the UK to talk to homeowners who wanted to adapt, change, extend their house. And basically we give a consultation and they would give money to a homeless charity. And we completely unnerved most of our clients, because we would say, well, actually, you don't need to do an extension. Why don't you just change that? And you certainly don't need an architect, and you should just do something simple. And I think there's a kind of too much appetite to change things and to do something that's fashionable, you know. And I think if you do things that are fashionable, it's axiomatic that you have to accept that it's also not going to be fashionable. So we're perpetuating this constant churn in buildings and spaces when, to be honest, I think they could be occupied quite easily, you know, with very minor changes or adaptations to the way we want to use them, rather than trying to overlay a new reading of activity. And I think that does sort of inform the sort of character approach. Pragmatically, it started partly because we respected the buildings, and we liked the kind of awkwardness and difficulty of these different layers that have been applied to buildings and spaces. But underneath them, there was this very strong structure and a kind of logic that we felt we could see. And that's what we tried to do in our later projects, was to make that structure and then allow others to introduce things into it. But on a kind of boring sense, when we started to practice, we could only work at a certain scale because there was only 2 of us, and then there was 3 of us. You know, what could we make ourselves? You know, what can we physically carry? What can we physically, you know, hire a van and go to some random builder's market on the edge of Moscow and, you know, get robbed, you know, and just buy stuff.
But one of the most important constraints we haven't mentioned is obviously the really tight budgets and really tight timescales.
Yeah.
And that's why most of the interventions had to be small and achievable within those constraints.
But how can you achieve the maximum impact with, you know, very limited budget? And budgets were minuscule on these projects.
Well, they might have been okay, but because the money ended up in people's pockets.
Yeah, the actual
what was left wasn't for the projects themselves wasn't very much. That's,
you know, but I do think this kind of accepting what's there and maybe just doing a tiny tweak or a little quirky thing here and there. If as long as you've got a big move or a big idea, everything else can be minor, and small, and it's something we always think about is, my mother, who might be listening, so is that, she's not trained as an architect. She's not, she doesn't understand space the same way that we all do, but she and the general public more widely can recognize spaces they like, even if they can't say why they like it. And I think that's what we should be focusing our energies on. And if we change them, we should put things in that we can take out again. That's a very rambling answer to a very succinct and eloquent question. So not sure we answered that, Liam. Sorry.
Sure, Liam, we'll forgive you. We've had one last question come in, and it's from someone who's not an architect. Somehow slipped in the back door. So, hi, I'm not an architect, and renovating, changing a property/house is very exciting. I know that the message is not to mess with changing too much. However, if it's the client's first time, do you think your advice to not change too much comes from doing the thing every day, and therefore you'd rather not do too much? Not doing too much because you have the experience, etc., whereas from a client's perspective, they don't.
I think it's not a question of whether it's not doing too much. It's about how bold you are. I think with projects, you can be bold. And I think if it's your first project or it's where you live, doing something bold that completely disrupts the building and spaces is great. And I also think that if you can do something bold, it disrupts and changes the way that you see the space and your home and how you occupy it. I think the risk is, I'm always amazed that you see people who get an architect to design their house for them. And, quite often these sort of one-off houses are, incredibly well considered, incredibly well detailed, very precise, very beautiful pieces of architecture. But it seems to us that quite often the client tends to want to sell it within about a year and move. And I do wonder whether that precision doesn't give people enough space to change the way they occupy it. Everything's so precise that, it captures the particular moment when they thought, well, actually, I'd like to put my toothbrush here, or I'd like to have my bed there. And, in 18 months time, they say, well, actually, I kind of want to do this now. I want to do that. But the project is too precise or too tailored to stop you doing that. So I think in all our projects, and our recommendation to clients is, if you're going to take something existing, try and do something bold that has the maximum impact, but creates spaces that you can occupy in different ways and you can move furniture around. So, just simple things like that. I mean, we hate built-in furniture. We hate anything that you can't sort of pick up and move out of a room, because it constrains how you understand the room and by implication how you use it. And we get bored. It's what human beings do. People get bored of everything being the same way. Maybe we get very bored because we're always moving, every sort of year or two. But I think it is that kind of itchy feet is quite important. So if you're doing your own home, you need to give yourself the ability to have itchy feet. There you go. That's a nice thought to end on.
Thanks very much. Well, we might let you go there, guys. Let you get on with your day, and we'll go off to dinner and or bed. Thanks so much. That was terrific. Really enjoyed it. It's such a great opportunity to be teaching this studio out at the University of Queensland and have an excuse to get back in touch with you guys and give you an opportunity to expend quite a lot of your precious time doing a favour for me for no particular reason. I'm delighted that you're willing to do it. And also, as I said earlier, genuinely delighted with how wonderful the presentation was. So I hope everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'll say farewell and look forward to the next time we can lean on you for a favour.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We're waiting for the air tickets to come over and do a similar lecture in person. I thought that was the deal.
Absolutely. We had another question come in. I thought it might have been an offer of sponsoring the trip, but unfortunately it's not. So I think I'll.
Well, no, we can take it. Don't worry.
No, I think we'll wrap it up.
Okay.
There. Thanks so much. That was great. Look forward to speaking to you guys again soon.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thank you
Good night,
ever so much.
everyone.
Good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.